नमस्कार सबैलाई म कलाकार आँचल शर्मा प्यारासुटको तर्फबाट प्यारासुट नेचुरल स्याम्पूको तर्फबाट यहाँ उपस्थित हुन पाउनुमा एकदमै 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 खुसी छु म सर्वप्रथम त प्यारासुट नेचुरली कला र साहित्यको महोत्सवमा उपस्थित हुनु त्यो माथि यस्तो प्रकृतिले भरिपूर्ण सहर पोखरामा र कलाकारहरूको चाहिँ आफू पनि यही क्षेत्र कलाकारिता क्षेत्रमा काम गरेको भएर चाहिँ कलाकारहरूले बोल्ने चिज या गर्ने क्रियाकलापले धेरैजनालाई प्रभावित पार्ने गर्दछ तर पनि कहीँ कतै यस्तो क्वेसन्सहरू आउँछ कि हाम्रो वास्तविक जीवनले कसैलाई प्रेरणा दिने हो या कसैलाई चाहिँ हामीप्रति आकर्षित गर्ने हो या हामीले निभाएका क्यारेक्टर्सहरूले चाहिँ आकर्षित गर्ने हो भन्ने चाहिँ म जहिले क्वेसन्सहरू दोधारमा परिरहेकै नै हुन्छु सो हाम्रो श्रेयाना भट्टाचार्यजीले चाहिँ एकदमै उहाँको एकदमै बढी बिक्री भएको पुस्तक र एकदमै क्रिटिकली अक्लेम्ड हाम्रो डेस्परेटली सिकिङ शाहरुख खानमा चाहिँ यो सबै जवाबहरूको उत्तर चाहिँ यहाँहरूले भेट्न सक्नुहुन्छ सो ढिला नगरी श्रेयाना भट्टाचार्यजी सँगसँगै हाम्रो पत्रकार सेवा भट्टराईजीलाई म एकचोटि स्टेजमा आमन्त्रण गर्न चाहन्छु स्टेज इज अल योर्स तर आइ एम सो थ्याङ्कफुल टुवर्ड्स यु गाइज किनभने मैले चाहिँ जहिले पनि सोचि नै रहेको हुन्थेँ हाम्रो व्यक्तिगत जीवनले प्रभाव पार्ने हो कि या हाम्रो क्यारेक्टरले हो कि हामीले रोल्सहरू किन विभिन्न रोल्सहरू निर्वाह गर्छौँ नि त सो नायकहरूले पनि फिल्ममा देखिन्छ जस्तो फाइट्सहरू गरेको होइन केटीहरूको प्रेममा त्याग गर्नेदेखि लिएर एक्लै नायक प्रधानमै रहेर कुरा गर्नुपर्दा चाहिँ उहाँहरूको बढी यो भूमिकाहरू भएको देखेर चाहिँ बजारमा या जनतामा या दर्शकमा चाहिँ त्यही नै छापहरू बसिरहेको हुन्छ सो आज म पनि यहीँ बस्छु हजुरको कुरा सुन्नलाई सो आइ एम रियली एक्साइटेड थ्याङ्क यू सो मच स्टेज इज अल योर्स थ्याङ्क यू
Hello everyone, my name is Sewa and I'm a freelance journalist and I'm here with Shrayana Bhattacharya, an economist who has written a book. The book is called Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh Khan. Welcome to Pokhara, Shrayana.
No, it's such a pleasure, and it's Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, just to be, but it's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much, Seva, for engaging with the book I know as deeply as you have.
Okay, so Shrayana, let's start talking about your book, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh. So when I heard that someone has written a book about Shah Rukh Khan, this was way before the festival. I followed your book on Twitter and I was so very excited that wow, there's a book out about Shah Rukh Khan and about women who like Shah Rukh Khan. And when I started reading the book, I realized that I had been a little duped because the book was not about Shah Rukh Khan at all. Yeah. It's about women and work. It's about women and the economy. So I'd like to start by asking you, why did you choose to use Shah Rukh Khan to frame a book about women and work?
Okay, before I answer, how many Shah Rukh Khan fans here? Just raise your hands. And, oh, that's actually significant. I can see someone actually jumping up. I'm hugging you metaphysically, thank you. And how many people here have studied economics at some point or the other? Okay, that's a smaller group. So I think that actually the fact that that intersection is so small is probably the reason why the book is called Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh and why I don't like using the word use, but yes, he is my research framework. So the book started in 2006. I was a young research assistant working for one of actually the world's largest labor unions for women in the informal economy. These are women who earn barely minimum wage. And I was sent out to do a survey, Seva. In fact, the name of the organization was Seva, where I was working. And I was asked to essentially ask all these women questions about their wages, about their working conditions, how many hours did they work. It's a very traditional survey questionnaire that economists are trained to administer. And when I started to do this, I realized very quickly that all these women looked so bored with my questions because they had seen women like me who are what they call survey wali didi, you know, with kajal in their eyes, wearing khadi kurta and has shown up. This was in Ahmedabad in a state called Gujarat. And I realized I needed to do something differently. And the only thing, as a social science researcher, you're taught is you use icebreakers. So I started asking all these women about who's your favorite actor. And everywhere I went, I met Shah Rukh fans. And I realized, funnily enough, that when I listened very closely to that first year of conversations, because I used this icebreaker technique in the slums of Ahmedabad, to the villages of Jharkhand, posh parts of Delhi. And the idea essentially was, I realized none of these women were actually talking about Shah Rukh. They were talking about how difficult it was for them to have money to watch him, to access markets, to be able to watch him, to have mobile phones of their own. And this became a very strange entry point for me to talk about economic freedom, which is what the book is about, as you yourself said. But the entry is fandom. And so I use fandom as almost a proxy to say, do you have the freedom to just watch your favorite actor? And the really sad part, I think, of the book is you realize that we live in, at least India is a country where most women don't. And the book is sort of pays tribute to that, the struggles of women to just be able to have the freedom to have fun.
Thank you, Shrayana. That was very interesting relationship between Shah Rukh Khan, fandom, and women's economic independence. So now let's talk about the real subject of your book, which to me is even more interesting than Shah Rukh Khan, if you can believe it. And the subject is women and work, women and the economy. You paint a very bleak picture of women and the economy in India, and we have this impression that India is now a liberal market, that the market has been liberalized, and that there's lots of economic opportunities. But what you are saying is that women get a very small slice of the pie. Can you describe the situation to us? What is the situation like for women in all kinds of social classes?
There's a line in the book, and I say that India has liberalized for its men. And women, I think, are still waiting for that liberation that I think economic reform promised at a point of time. So if you look at the data, and I present this in the book, what you find is 16%, I think, of jobs in the top 10 fastest growing sectors in India have accrued to women. Women and female employment rates and women's economic freedoms remain in the bottom 5 in India and the world are, in fact, the rest of the South Asia region, we were talking about this earlier, does much better. So even Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka will have higher female employment rates, and India and Pakistan tend to be sort of neighbors when you look at global rankings, and I describe in the book why that's happening. And I think what's happened is that we forget that we have a labor market in India, and I think the book is a reminder of that, which is 84% of the labor force is men. 64% of women's work is unpaid. We consistently remain in the bottom 5. The World Economic Forum recently just produced its own recent, again, gender rank on economic freedom, and we're again in the bottom 5. We are, I think, the only South Asian country which is in the bottom 5, or maybe Pakistan joins us in that group. And what's happened largely, Sewa, is that the sectors that have grown essentially have done two things: construction and retail. These are jobs that typically men have essentially absorbed, and even service sector jobs other than aviation and hospitality, and I describe this in the book as well. Most of these jobs, the gains from growth have gone to men. And I think, in fact, what's really strange about India, as opposed to, say, other countries that have grown as rapidly as India has, is if you look at a Brazil, or you look at a China, or you look at an Indonesia, as economic growth rates have gone up, women's employment rates tend to grow up as well. What's happened in India is the exact opposite, which is that as we've grown, actually female employment rates have really come down. And part of what's happening is that actually as households have earned more money, they feel women no longer need to be out of the house earning an income. They can be at home. And that's, partly positive for some women, partly not great for others. And I think in the book I describe just the complexity of that choice, and is it really a choice in some cases as well. And what's also happening is that there are parts of the economy that are producing jobs for women, but those jobs are unpaid. So you see this, home-based work, helping the feminization of agriculture, supporting household enterprises, but you're not really remunerated for it, doing much more care work as well, but you're not remunerated. So I think what's happened is the economy has grown, but the structure of that conversation, the structure of that growth has been masculine. And so you see in the book, there are all these stories of women who are just trying to earn an income, and how hideously hard that can be, and how patriarchal to the core the economy remains. And that hasn't really changed post-liberalization. I think we are an independent country, but I always say Indian women are still waiting for their independence. And I think the book just describes that with just people's stories with some depth and people had access to.
Thank you. I think what you say speaks not just about India, but also about the entire South Asian region. And that's why we in Nepal can also relate to what you've talked about the growth of the economy, which has left women out, and about a much higher rate of employment for men and a much lower rate for women. And much lower income in areas which are prominently female-led, for example, nursing or teaching or other service-related jobs. And you've also talked about the difficulty of capturing the economic contributions of women, for example, in agriculture or at home, for instance. Can you talk a little bit about that, the history of how the economic researchers have left women out, and how there's been an attempt to quantify the economic contributions of women?
Yeah, so I'm very familiar with the Indian statistical apparatus, so I'll use that as an example. And actually, I do know that countries like Nepal, Bangladesh follow, these are similar paradigms. What tends to happen is we tend to think that these surveys only pick up people who are earning a taxed paycheck as a worker, but that's not true. Actually, the statistical definition of work is much broader. So for example, if you're doing home-based work within the home, earning a piece rate for making some garments at home, technically the statistical machinery of these countries captures your work. For example, if you're doing part-time work, if you're a domestic worker or you're a street vendor, technically the way the surveys are designed in many of these countries, India specifically, that work is captured. And yet, despite this very broad idea of work, we're at now, I think, 21%, or I think the latest data is 24% of women have an income, an independent income in India, which is very worrying. And I think what's happened is, while the statistical apparatus actually has tried very hard to try and capture different types and facets of women's work, where I think we're lagging behind is actually having a credible policy conversation around, do we value care or not? If you look, for example, at the Maternity Benefits Act, this was actually very positive that happened in India. There was a big reform, it's been expanded. And yet, the definition of who is eligible for extended leave, for protection and benefits, is largely women in the formal sector, which leaves out 90% of the economy, because most women are at home doing ad hoc jobs as well, and not really, only about 20% of our workforce has a contract, a written contract. So given that you're excluding a majority of the workers. So I think what's happened is, Sewa, I think while statistics has actually moved forward, the statistical machinery has moved forward to try and capture women's work better. Where I think we're lagging behind is, okay, so now we know women are involved in care. Do we credibly value it? Do we invest in it? Do we remunerate women? When Dr. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister, there was actually a proposal at that time to think about giving cash transfers to women, unconditional, just to reward them for the care work that they were doing. And that didn't really have legs. It was a proposal that was discussed. I think given that, I think it's actually more the political will and question of policy and politics where I think we're lagging behind. I actually don't think it's so much about, does the statistical apparatus capture this work? Does the statistical apparatus do this strongly enough. I will say one thing though, which is one of the most difficult problems, and you see this in the book because I myself was a surveyor, is that when you ask women, do you have a job? It's very common, in India at least, people will say, I do work, but I don't have a job. So in Hindi, you would say, मेरी नौकरी है, but मेरी नौकरी नहीं है, मैं काम करती हूँ, right? So there's a distinction. And so while the statistically machinery does define work very broadly and actually tries to capture a lot of the care work or other types of work that women are doing, often then it's also survey fatigue and you don't capture it because people don't report it, which is socialized as well. You don't see it as work. Many women still don't see care and motherhood as work, although that is actually fundamentally, if you look at the labor market in India right now, motherhood and marriage is the primary jobs that women have, to be cute about it a bit. So I think it's largely a question of politics and policy, not so much a question of statistics and whether we're capturing, as economists, are we thinking about capturing this work or not. I do think that conversation has moved much further, but do we reward it, do we remunerate it? That's still a vacuum.
Thank you. And you've also spoken about how, these kinds of barriers cut across, race, caste, class, and all these different hierarchies, and that women in every class are disadvantaged, compared to their male counterparts. So what are some of these structural barriers or social barriers that are keeping women from becoming fully involved in the economy?
So if you look at the history of, at least, again, the Indian statistics, which is what I present in the book, I think there are 3 reasons why we're seeing women just being excluded consistently from the economy. One is the very traditional reason of care, which is that not only are we in the bottom 5 when it comes to women's employment, India is also in the bottom 5 when it comes to men helping out in housework. So essentially domestic duties, the idea of care work, it rarely gets renegotiated despite the fact that the country is growing and things are changing. And you think on media things have changed, but if you look at the statistics of how people are spending their time, you realize that really hasn't changed. So care remains an overwhelming burden of women, which, as we were talking about just earlier, they're not remunerated or recognized for in a very formal way. So there's the whole language of care, and once care becomes part of all the decisions you're going to make about your job, it just sets you up for very difficult job choice decisions, which I think any woman will know. And internally, you've internalized it, right? Like, you will take a job which is close to your home, you need flexibility, all these things, which just changes the dynamic of how you show up as an agent in the economy, as opposed to men who are unencumbered. So that's one. I think the second massive problem is that all our infrastructure and housing markets hate single women. I mean, I actually use the word hate because if you are trying to find a house on your own, you're trying to find credit markets on your own, any instrument that allows you to be independent and an autonomous being, markets are just not designed. Markets are designed for families, they're designed for single men, they're designed for married women. They're designed for elderly who are part of a familial construct. But if you are a single woman, right from the passport requiring a male's name, your wife of, daughter of, all of those things, to savings instruments. So the fact that it's just difficult to find a house on your own if you're just a single woman living in even the poshest part of Delhi. So given that our infrastructure markets are so hideously discriminatory, is it that surprising that women then don't follow career opportunities and follow jobs? Because one of the things we know, and this is true, by the way, of countries like Nepal as well, which is that jobs are clustered in certain centers. Jobs are not distributed equally everywhere. So to actually follow opportunity, you need to go to a particular place and live on your own. Now, for example, if the housing and the credit market is not going to let you live on your own, how will you actually pursue jobs? So that's the second part, which is, I think, there's a whole conversation about how infrastructure deals with single women and the fact that it just hates single women, especially markets for housing and finance. And the third, which is, I think something that's been discussed recently in the context of the news cycle in India, is violence. I mean, I don't like this distinction I know some people make between violence outside the home and violence inside the home. I think actually they're continuums. But you don't feel safe. Transport is not always safe. The design of cities and job opportunities don't make you feel assured that you can show up and be a productive worker. And economists would call this the cost of keeping track. You're always keeping track of how you're seeing, how you're holding your body. And if you have these kinds of constraints, are you really going to be as productive, say, as someone who's not thinking about so many of these constraints, right? So that's the third. And the fourth, of course, and I think this is really important, is just the structure of the economy. I mean, right now we have an economy in India that values certain types of jobs that require showing up at work or a factory. So fields and factories are the economy. But if you are working from home, making garments in a long supply chain that ends up eventually on our backs, that still doesn't mean that you're technically part of the economy, because our policy discourse doesn't recognize it, doesn't regulate it, doesn't reward it. And there's, even minimum wage is a bare specification, right, for many of these jobs. And so given that women tend to be in this very invisible part of the economy, I think what you're seeing is also dissatisfaction on part of many of the women, and you see this in the book amongst women from the precariat in the book. They don't want to do the jobs that they're doing, but they do it because they really need to earn that money. And so I think it's also the structure of the economy and the way it's growing. It's growing such that certain sectors which tend to be much more masculine are growing, and they're offering more job opportunities. But the sectors that offer women job opportunities are much more feminized, be it contract care workers. They're going on strike every month in India. You just don't see that balance being switched out. So I think these are 4 families of reasons why you're seeing these very low rates of employment right now.
Thank you. And, despite all these very difficult barriers, we still know that women want to be a part of the, formal workforce. And you've written about it so eloquently in your book, especially tying it up with movies and Shah Rukh Khan. And I especially like this part where you had a table about, how much characters speak in the top 10 movies, Like for example, in the more commercial successes, women are speaking less than 10%. And in Shah Rukh Khan's movies, women are speaking 25% or 50%, or in Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, even the 60% of the dialogues is for women. So here, how you're trying to say that here India's women want independence and intimacy, So how does that come? It's not really captured by the statistics, right? But it's only captured when someone like you brings out the human stories. So can you speak something about, the aspirations of women in India for independence and intimacy?
I think women just want to be able to speak and be heard. I don't think this is true for India. I think it's true for any country in the world. There's a paper, I think anyone who's interested in this kind of thing, on the current American Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. Each time she shows up, there's a paper called Yelling at Yellen. And the idea is that even her, when she shows up to American congressional hearings and she's talking about budget speeches, she's constantly interrupted. They don't let her speak. They're just cutting her off constantly, relative to, say, men who are exactly in the same role that she was. And so this, by the way, is not just true of India, Nepal, South Asia. I think this is just a global point of view, which is women just want to be heard. And I think the reason Shah Rukh comes up constantly in these conversations, I realize, is because he's always playing characters who are listening to women. And I measured, actually, talk time of women, as you mentioned, and he just lets women speak, and he doesn't interrupt them. His characters don't interrupt them. His characters may be stalkers, dons, robots, there may be terrible regressive politics that's going on in the films, but they don't interrupt these women. They let them speak, and they actually respond to them. So that's one. So there's a kind of deliberative muscle, which I think on average the Indian uncle just does not have, right? And I think Shah Rukh is the anti-uncle. I really believe this. And you see this constantly in the book, right? Like all these women are constantly saying, it's so nice to see a guy, and the standards are so low, which is that the guy just listens to you and lets you speak. And that is considered, sort of so remarkable. And so that was fascinating to me. So I think that's one. And I think the other aspiration is, beyond just being heard in this deliberative muscle, I think is to just be left alone. I think there's a woman in the book who basically says, I don't want to be, she said, I don't want to be in a magazine cover. I don't want to be someone's victim. I just want a house, to quote that wonderful Virginia Woolf, I want a room of my own. I just want space of my own. and I'm going to pay my taxes, and I just want to be left alone. And sadly, you know, in countries like ours, where women's bodies have become so intrinsically linked to our politics, our economy, the way our social structures are sustained, and very oppressive ones, women's bodies will never be left alone. And you only need to just open up any newspaper any day or just scan social media and you'll know what I mean. I think all of us intuitively know this. And I think given that context, what I'm realizing with all these women in the book is that they just want to be left alone, and they want to be left alone, and their idea of being left alone is they just want to stare at Shah Rukh on their own. And I realize actually he's a metaphor in this book, not just of like this ideal man, but just escape, right? Escape from patriarchy is just being able to have fun. The women in my book watch Shah Rukh Khan. I think there would be other women who perhaps escape from patriarchy watching football or doing something else. That's up to them. And I think it's an exit, right? So that's the second. And the third, I think every woman wants to be kissed on the neck, which is a big thing that keeps coming up in the book, which is you realize that there's this constant refrain that he seems to know what to do with a woman's body, and he needs to train all these men on what to shape up better. And you keep hearing this constantly. And I think it's a conversation around sort of how do you navigate desire and how do you navigate autonomy. And I think if you ask me what are these aspirations, I go into so much granular detail with the lives of these women that I was privileged to know for 15 years. But I think largely it is to be heard, for someone to actually engage with them, particularly men. I think to be left alone and to be kissed on the neck.
Thank you. That's amazing. Let's talk about the left alone aspect a little bit more. That's what you end the book with. You talk about how we don't, after Shah Rukh Khan, we don't really have another male superstar. There's no one like him. But now what the young women like are the actresses. They like how the actresses like Deepika and Priyanka are so focused on their work, and they're so independent and autonomous. And so can you talk a little bit about that, the being left alone aspect, and how that admiration, again, linking, using Bollywood to frame a very serious issue of women's empowerment. What do women want economically and, in those aspects?
Yeah, one of the things I realized, because I followed women and then their daughters for at least this period of time that I knew them. And I realized there was this very interesting intergenerational shift, because you found that while the older generation of women love Shah Rukh Khan because he's the benevolent patriarch, right? Like he'll take care of you, he's the sensitive guy, the ideal male breadwinner. You realize the generation below, I actually say this in the book, they don't want to marry Shah Rukh, they want to be him. They are not interested in having a man in their life who will take care of them the way he, takes care of the women in his life, or he, pretends and talks about his family. But they're interested in just being as successful as him. And you see this shift. And so if you use that as a metric, it's not surprising to me that then many of them start to say, well, I'm obsessed with Priyanka Chopra, or I love, because these are spectacles of female achievement, be it in sport, in film, that actually historically we haven't really seen. Because not only are these women financially successful, and very obviously so, because they're on Instagram all the time or on a news cycle, but I think they're also successful while having a personal and sex life which is very open, because people know who Deepika Padukone's ex-boyfriend was. There's no sense of shame in it. People know who different people have dated, and there's a way in which these women have shown up in the public eye, which says, well, it's okay for you to have a sexual history or romantic history of the past, and then be an economic agent and be successful. And I think that duality, that those two elements really speak to a lot of younger women's aspirations, sort of the generation even before, after us. And I think that's why you're seeing this big obsession with so many of the movie stars who are female. And I really believe the next Shah Rukh Khan is a woman. And I think you see this in the stories that the women say.
Yay, we're hoping for a woman, Shah Rukh Khan, yes. So also finally, we've talked about all the problems that women are facing, especially the structural barriers, and especially when related to policies which don't help them. So do you have recommendations for what kind of policies that women need to help them participate better in the workforce and to get what they want, which is independence and independency, as you've said?
Yeah, I should say that I don't represent the views of the institutions I work for formally when I make my recommendations. I think actually nothing short, sadly, of affirmative action is going to do it. Right now we have quotas for women in leadership in boards, and right now corporate boards in India, only 18% of these positions are filled by women. 18. It's abysmal. And this is actually celebrated as if this is such an amazing thing because we've come from 6% around 5 years ago. And that's after a law which actually mandates that you must have female representation on these boards. So I actually now have realized, given the kinds of psychological barriers that exist because of social conditioning, the way I think, asking, you can say men are allies, and I believe, of course, men are allies, but asking men and women who've benefited from patriarchy in a certain way works to support radical reform where women will be out and earning an independent income and they can exit extremely unhappy familial situations. I think it's a very difficult and it's a tough ask. And so I think policy has to step in with basically one, affirmative action. Second, those markets I was telling you about, housing for women. There are countries in East Asia that provide incentives for landlords or for those who try and give housing loans to women, particularly single women, to try and encourage women to feel safe and assured in trying to at least have a house of your own or a room of your own. I'm very excited by things like transport vouchers, allowing women to, you see this in different states in India where women are being allowed now to actually use income to be able to, travel on a bus free, or you have a subsidized ticket. So I think subsidizing some of these frictions that women face in accessing infrastructure. And the third is, of course, I'm a big believer, all men should be put through like some finishing school with Shah Rukh's films. So they can learn better, but other than being facetious about that, I think infrastructure and I think affirmative action is where, and I dream of a day where we remunerate women for care, but I'm too pragmatic. I know that that's not going to happen, but I dream of that day still.
Let's hope. Thank you, Shrayana, that you speak not just for India, but also for a lot of the South Asian experiences. Now, let's see if we have any questions for Shrayana.
Hi, Shrayana. Hi. Like I met you before, I told you I love Shah Rukh Khan. Yeah, so my question to you is, desperately seeking Shah Rukh Khan made it to Manath in Shah Rukh Khan's library. So how was it like for you to meet him? And what did Shah Rukh Khan feel about a book being written about him, which has so much about, women's economy, like you just talked about? So, yeah.
The book is in Manath. 6 months after the release of the book, I was asked to come and I thought I was giving it to his manager, but turned out it was actually him and his manager. It was, if there's one person, and I've actually had a very hard time, I have to say, and I was discussing it with Sewa, and there are people like Akshay in the audience who know this. I've had a very hard time explaining to people the book is not about Shah Rukh Khan, because everybody, for some reason, just thinks, because it's the name, immediately the understanding is it's either erotic fan fiction about him, or it's a biography, right? And honestly, you can have blurbs by the world's top economists, and I have a Nobel laureate in there. That doesn't matter. People just see Shah Rukh. But the first person who actually didn't even ask me for a second whether it was about Shah Rukh Khan was Shah Rukh Khan, because he knew immediately that it was about the economy. He has a very nice note. He wrote a note. Most of it will always remain private, but there's a line from it which is in the paperback edition, which we added, where he said it was really heartening to learn about the economics of things from the book. So he understood that he plays the role of a research framework, and I think he seemed to quite enjoy that. And of course, because how many people in the world can become a research framework, right? Like how many people become language? I mean, if you went and asked anybody else about very many other actors, I doubt that they would essentially coalesce around a language. That Shah Rukh would mean mobility, he would mean, sexual prowess, he would mean a masculinity that's different. I think it is actually testimony to his career that he has become language and he understood that. So that was really lovely. I did not faint, so that was very nice as well, because I fully expected to. But it is amazing that, and he has an economics background from Delhi University himself. So I think part of it is just that. But he fully understood that the book it's about him, but it's not about him. That it's largely not about him, but he's there as a framework and a language. And he's written a note celebrating that fact, so that was really wonderful. I say this to everyone who asks me this, which is that I often tell, we say we should never meet your heroes, but if Shah Rukh Khan is your hero, you must meet him, because he won't, Whoever wrote that saying has never thought about him, so.
Any other questions? Oh.
Yeah. Hi, Shrayana. Hi, Sewa. Both of you. Wonderful conversation, and I'm glad to see substantial number of men here. So one of my favorite movies of Shah Rukh Khan is an underrated one, which is Chak De India. How he single-handedly inspires women hockey team to just win it, So my question is, how can men play a crucial role in inspiring women to join fields such as sports or predominantly men-driven occupations like armed forces or that pay significantly higher, What role can men like these play in bringing women to the front line and inspiring them to take up space and just rule over economy?
That's a great question. How many Akshay Kumar fans here? Before I'm about to say what I'm about to say, I should check. Are there any? 2. Okay, so you'll forgive me. Okay, just forgive me. But I'm going to say, have you seen the films where Akshay Kumar plays a scientist at, I think ISRO it is, and then there are women scientists. I'm always struck by those films because what's fascinating to me is that the women, and I measure this, women don't speak. I mean, he's talking on behalf. There's a behalfism that is happening in certain kinds of cinema that's supposed to be encouraging women, where we don't let women speak. The other example of this is Amitabh Bachchan in Pink, which is a film about sexual violence, but because of the way it's set up, and it's a wonderful film, I enjoyed it, but I learned a lot, but he's speaking much, much more all the time. And I think the first thing, it sounds really simple and foolish, but it's actually very important, and data showing us is really important, is men have to just learn to listen to women, let us complete sentences. And you realize anyone who's working in HR, and I've been interviewing people for what I want to do next, for a book, people who manage human resources in different organizations, be it corporate finance. I've been talking to a lot of people who manage mutual funds of late. And what's fascinating to me is they'll keep telling me that it's really hard to actually train men in these workplaces to let certain kinds of younger men and women, irrespective of what role or what authority they're at, to just complete their point of view. So I think to start with, I think beyond just inspiring, just listening and actually absorbing and engaging, I think that's actually a muscle that we really need to actually slowly coach all of us to have. But particularly, I think men in positions of authority or even male colleagues in the workplace, that's one. I say this for the Indian workplace, in corporate finance, in science, certainly in academia. So that's one. The second, I think, what's really important, like you used the example of Chak De, and I describe it in detail in the book, which is that at the end of the day, sure, all the women sort of, he was the coach, but these women also rallied around each other, right? And I think setting up systems, I don't actually believe it will require men for women to be in the sciences. I mean, there are many women. Right now, India, for example, has the highest number of female pilots in the world, and no one really inspired them. And it's actually father-daughter relationships, funnily enough. It's a lot of intergenerational investment within families. I don't think it requires icons, but it requires that level of support. So that's the second thing. And the third, all the policy stuff that we just talked about, I don't know what the numbers are in Nepal, but our legislatures and decision-making systems, who's making policy, is all it's an old boys' club, and it doesn't matter which party comes in power, but the boys' club seems to remain. And I think the biggest thing that men then in power can do is give up power, right? And let women actually come in and start to make some of these decisions and change the way they think about these things. I think that's really important. So to me, it would be those three.
Thank you, Shrayana. As somebody who's been mansplained to a lot, I personally thank you for this answer. So there's a question.
The Akshay Kumar fan, please don't get angry at me.
Namaste, Shrayana. Congratulations. This is wonderful. First, when I heard about the book, I also thought it's about Shah Rukh Khan. But then I checked in the Google, and then I found that it was actually about informal economy and women. You presented very well their aspirations and desire and constraints and everything. And the book is relevant for whole South Asia, as you said, right? There are two things that I want your views on. One is, how do we encourage men, facilitate and encourage men to share the care work, to share the care work burden of women? It involves for all kind of, all women, of any positions, they are overburdened with the care work. So that's one thing. How can state also facilitate this transition is important. Another is, I come from Kathmandu, and in Kathmandu we have, a mission of our mayor that he wants to clean the road, and that's why he's, chasing informal women workers, especially the vegetable vendors, who have very important role in economy. So what is in your views, you are economist, so in your views, how do you think this, how can we link this informal, the women who are working in informal sector to the formal sector? And how do we expand the social protection for them? So it's just your views as an economist.
You're asking me now to wear my regular job hat. I'll answer. I think on the quick question on how to encourage more men to show up in the kitchen so that we're not in the bottom 5, I think it'll take two things. One is going to sound very frivolous, but it's actually very powerful, which is that, you know how women are always asked in the marriage market, can you cook, can you clean, can you I think it's high time now in the marriage market and in the mating market, on apps, on things, women should start asking people that I'm just going to swipe left or whichever the wrong swipe is if you're not able to just participate in some of this work. So that's one. And the second, I do think what's going to be very important moving forward is paternity leave policies. We in India at least have a very generous maternity benefit act now. I think it can do a lot more when it comes to paternity benefits as well. We don't have a conversation about that yet. I know many men who would like to actually be able to, and they do it of their own volition, but imagine people who can't afford to, right? There's so many. And I think paternity policies, along with policies that are personal policies in the dating market, in the mating and arranged marriage market, I think that's where very interpersonal, I'm a big believer in interpersonal, intimate spaces for change, for social change. I don't think it'll come from a law, or it won't come from, even if we have the best laws, and we have some wonderful laws in India, yet the idea of implementing them actually come from, interpersonal spaces. So I think that's one. On the question of linking the informal economy to the formal, I'm actually, so the data of the world, and right now the World Bank has a new social protection report, I'd encourage you to see it. Data from the world, and the IMF, the ILO, World Bank, all these organizations are coming out and saying that this idea that we are going to formalize and grow is now an idea we need to somewhat retire, because informality is not going anywhere, right? So what you need to think about is, how do you design policies that recognize the informality, be it gig workers, be it platform workers, be it home-based workers, different types of workers who are within the informal economy. How do you regulate and intervene better? Technology is a great tool. So these ideas of co-contributory, pensions, insurance, things like that. So I think that's one. I think on the question that you were saying about cleaning up the city, one of the cities that I started the book in is in Ahmedabad, and Ahmedabad is another example of this, where they've really attacked the vendors of the livelihoods of street vendors, simply because they wanted a clean city. And I think this goes back to, it sounds very boring and very, it's not a very glamorous or sexy response, but actually it goes back to political coalitions, right? When we think about urban design, who's sitting in these rooms when we're having these conversations? I can say, for example, with the example of Gujarat, that when workers' organizations and Sewa and different organizations started participating in these conversations, you started to see differences in decisions that were made, or at least shifts, right? So I think, to me, this is where it's all about coalition building between civil society and those who are thinking about planning. I think for too long, and this, actually my book strangely is also a response to this, for too long we tend to just leave certain very important conversations to technocrats. And you only need to, I'm going to quote a Pakistani economist, he recently said, you only need to talk to a technocrat to know a technocracy will never work. And I think it's time that in political decision-making systems, the role of CSOs and the role of workers' organizations and local governance, that's critical in making some of these trade-offs and links possible. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with these, because the planner doesn't think about often the livelihoods. I mean, some planners do, but not all. And I think this is where it becomes very important to create that coalition. So yeah, I would encourage you to look up the reports that I was mentioning. There's actually a lot on this then.
Thank you again, Shrayana. Do we have any questions? Oh, so many.
I think we should have a gentleman at the back. We've had, I think, largely only women who ask us questions, and then she can go last. Sir, I hope you're not an Akshay Kumar fan.
No. Thank you very much. It was great listening to you, and it would have been even better if I had read the book earlier. But now,
Please do,
now
sir.
I'll do. Now I'll do. So my question is about the situation that's evolving in India. Whenever we talk about these things improving, there is also one patriarchal backlash that's going on, especially related to the politics in India. And recently, I was listening to one interview with Mallika Sarabhai about the Gujarat, where in 2002, while Hindu men were out rampaging and murdering and raping Muslim women, their women folk were actually cheering the men. That's the situation. So, how do you see this thing while we see that some movements ahead, but there are some steps that are going backward, especially with the resurgence of patriarchy and the extreme right-wing politics in India? So how do those two things relate?
That's such a great point. I'm so glad you brought it up. Actually, one of the women I follow in the book, in fact, that neighborhood in Ahmedabad where the book is born is actually one of the neighborhoods which was impacted by the riots, and she has many stories and things to tell, and I'd encourage you to just read the book in a very different way along with all the fact-finding reports that were just so heartbreaking. I want to answer your question, but I want to answer it through Shah Rukh, and I'll give you and I think you'll understand what I'm trying to say. 15 years ago, when I started the research for this book, when I told anyone I'm doing a book on Shah Rukh Khan, no one would ever ask me whether this had anything to do with his religion. His faith, if you see this in the book, his faith never comes up. Women see him as successful, sexy, some women don't even like him, but they don't come at him ever from the perspective of religion. And yet, I think when the book released, which it came out a year ago, my father, actually at a point of time, told me, are you sure you don't want the book coming out under a pseudonym? Because it was just the kinds of, you can imagine the things that happen online, right? I mean, the level of trolling. And it was suddenly, the question that everybody wanted to ask me about Mr. Khan was his role as a representative of his faith. And I think this tells you what the shift, at least in popular imagination in 15 years. He has a film coming out right now, and there are people issuing death threats, and it's really horrible and sad. Having said that, I will also say, and I'm seeing there's a time up thing, but I will just say that none of the women till date that I meet, and the women in the book are cross-faith, cross-caste, it's a coalition of very different groups of women. Nobody ever talks about his identity. It's just it's not salient, it never comes up. And even now, I'm in touch with them. And recently there was this big furor, I don't know if you know about this, but in India, our wonderful singer Lata Mangeshkar passed away, and Mr. Khan went to do, there was a dua, right, that he was offering, and then there were people saying, oh, is he spitting on her? And I remember I was talking to a young woman who I followed in the book, and we were talking about how he's become this symbol of Indian secularism for some, and she said, well, I don't care if he's secular, I only care if he's sexy. So I will leave it at that maybe sexiness and the road outside bandstand is our way out of this current equilibrium.
Thank you, Shrayana. That was wonderful. Now, we've been told that our time is up, and if there are any more questions, you can discuss with Shrayana outside. Thank you, Shrayana, for your very eloquent and articulate presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.